Good afternoon. I'm Steve Vogel, and on behalf of the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, I'm delighted to welcome you here and also to introduce our two speakers. Let me begin with our discussant, Sarang Shah, whom I know quite well, and yet I learned some things in doing a little research for today. He is a JD, i.e. a lawyer, but he's also a PhD student in political science. But that's not enough. He has also studied theoretical physics, researched computational neuroscience. More recently, he's done research on money and politics at MapLight and written for Palantir Technologies and CrowdPack. There's a lot in his bio, but I'll just throw out a few random facts that I thought were interesting. He's been an editor and contributor to the Law and Political Economy blog. As some of you may know, Law and Political Economy is kind of a movement within the study of law. He was, I love this, Louis Brandeis Law and Political Economy Fellow at Open Markets, which you may know works on antitrust and market competition issues. And he also founded Distilled Magazine, a publication and international community dedicated to telling a narrative about where we are as a global society. He also wrote a play. Nick Romeo, our guest today, is a journalist, a critic, and an essayist. He has spent years covering policy and ideas for New Yorker magazine. He's also written for the Washington Post, New York Times, Scientific American, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, New Republic, et cetera, et cetera. He also happens to teach at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. Lots of things we could say about him. I'm not going to say a word about the book because you are going to hear about that momentarily. But I'll just make a suggestion, which is go to his webpage and look at his articles. Now, some of these articles probably have been in some ways incorporated into the book a little, but it just gives a sense of kind of the range of things he does. So these are just articles, right? Can companies force themselves to do good? Is it time for a new economics curriculum? Should gig work be government run? How the self-serving attitudes of the 9.9% perpetuate inequality. Fair trade comes to American farms. Those were just selections from a much longer list. But it kind of struck me as very Bessie-esque, if that's a thing, like that some of the themes that he's interested in are the ones that we're interested in here at Bessie. I think that will be very obvious as he presents some of his ideas from his hot off the press book. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, how's my audio? It's good? Okay. Well, thanks to Steve and Sarang, and I also would like to thank everyone for coming out. I appreciate that. It's tough post-pandemic to show up in person, so I appreciate everyone coming. The plan is really just to kind of give you a partial tour of some of the ground that's covered in the book, and then to have a conversation about that. The book grows out of a lot of reporting for The New Yorker. In fact, a lot of the articles that Steve mentioned became book chapters. The most concise introduction, I think, to some of the major themes in the book comes from two of my favorite economists. So I'm going to show you a brief video.
Mr. Lully, is it?
That's correct, yes.
Excellent.
Glad you could see me at such short notice.
Not at all. Do sit down.
Thanks very much.
Can I offer you a coffee?
Oh, that would be very nice, yes, thanks.
Right. How do you like it?
Decaffeinated, jug method, low mineral content spring water, not quite brought to the boil, with semi-skim milk with 1 NutraSweet unstirred.
Right. Mark?
Yes?
Do we still have that chemistry set in the office? Well then, just one coffee, please.
Okay.
Right. Now, Mr. Lully, you're after a loan, is that right?
That's about the size of it, yeah.
You say in your letter that you're starting up a new business and you'd like to take advantage of our new Greedo startup package.
That's absolutely correct, yes.
You don't actually say what the product is that you're hoping to market.
Well, as it happens, I've actually brought along a couple of samples with me.
Excellent.
We haven't actually settled on brand names yet, but basically, the blue sachet is cocaine and the red is heroin.
Sorry?
the market research we've done so far has indicated that cocaine is thought of as a brighter, fresher product, therefore the blue, and heroin is warmer, more passionate, hence the red. If you disagree, I'd certainly value your input.
You're planning to sell and distribute drugs?
On the button. Yep, the market's there, I'm ready to go, and let's face it, Europe's open for business.
Yes,
Problem?
Possibly.
Well, I think perhaps I know what you're going to say. Certainly up until now, this is an area which has been hedged about with a lot of rules and regulations, and to be quite honest, when I first looked at this market, I thought to myself, hey, I'd be better off manufacturing red tape.
Red tape, yes.
But thankfully those times are changing now. Whole new markets are opening up and I'm ready to play them.
Yes, but...
The demand is there, no question.
Is it? Well...
One of the most exciting things for me is that it's such a young market.
Young?
Oh, yes, immensely young. Yes, consumer profiling indicates the 12 to 15-year-old segment, and, you know, if we can instill brand loyalty into them at that age, well, that's got to be good news.
But...
But, yes, you're thinking 12 to 15-year-olds, do they have the income? Well, what I always say to that is this. If the product's right, they'll find the income. You know, their mother's handbags, car stereos, old-age pensioners, wherever it is.
Yes. I hesitate to use a word like this. I know it's old-fashioned, but do you think this is strictly moral?
I beg your pardon?
Moral? Do you think it's moral?
Moral?
Yes.
I'm not sure if I've actually got any precise figures on that. Susie said she'd give me a bar chart
No,
or something.
no. Is it moral to do this at all? You know, with children and so on.
Well, let me just say this. I mean, would you rather we stood idly by and let the Germans, the Dutch, South Americans take over our market share? Huh? Where's the precious morality then?
Well,
Up a gum tree without a paddle, that's where it is. The question is this, either you believe in market forces or you don't.
Ah, well, I can help you there because I don't.
You don't?
No, I don't believe in market forces. I used to, of course, when I was a child, but like everybody else, when I grew older, I discovered it was all made up.
Made up?
Yes. Yes, I can still remember the exact day I found out it. It was a Christmas Eve, and I couldn't sleep, and I crept downstairs, and I heard my, parents, they were talking and arguing and laughing about market forces and saying how they were going to have to break it to me one day. It came as a bit of a blow, as you can imagine. 2 years later, I discovered that Father Christmas didn't exist either.
Didn't exist? You're kidding!
Well, did you still...
Yes, I did, actually, yes.
I am sorry.
Growing up, eh?
Okay, so on the principle of sort of not saying in 300 pages what a few British comics can say in 3 minutes, I could just end the presentation there, never have written the book, but there's a lot to say. I mean, I could do an entire talk just on those 3 minutes. Instead, I'm going to kind of segue into my book. So the first chapter starts with the battle for the heart of the Econ 101 curriculum in academia. And to start with a bit of historical context, you might wonder, where does the belief in market forces come from? I sort of thought about making this a call and response or a kind of quiz. I haven't kicked the pedagogue mode, but I'm not going to ask anyone to try to ID the first one. I'm just going to tell you this is from David Ricardo. So he's writing in the early 19th century, and you can see the analogy to the laws of gravitation. And what he's doing here is he's criticizing poverty relief in England. Fast forward a century, and this is going to be fairly schematic. I'm going to move quickly through a lot of material. This is Yale professor William Graham Sumner. He's describing, once again, with an analogy to market forces, and notice here, once again, the analogy to natural laws, physical laws. He's using this in an argument against any kind of antitrust regulation. There's something inevitable about the concentration of corporate wealth that he thinks is akin to the law of gravitation. Fast forward another century, this is from Science in 2014. People who call themselves econophysicists are comparing the income distribution in societies around the world, and they're sort of likening it to lots of other patterns in the natural world. Everything from the size of ant colonies follows a certain distribution, but also in the human domain, you have sort of circulation numbers for newspapers that basically take hugely disparate data sets, notice a pattern, evoke inevitability, throw in the word physics, and you can kind of see the justification of the status quo. This is all, for what it's worth, a bit of context that could be helpful when you think about where did Stephen Fry's and Hugh Laurie's, so what's the sort of deep intellectual archaeology of the ideas in that sketch? A little bit more immediately, obviously, the sketch comes out right after Margaret Thatcher has been in power for about a decade. The title of my book is an allusion to a famous slogan of hers, "There is no alternative." You might plausibly think that this is a characterization of all economists, and that would certainly not be the case. This slide could be Cambridge comes to the rescue. The first quote is John Maynard Keynes. He has a much more capacious vision of economics. In fact, at one point, this is not on this slide, he compares it to a side of political philosophy, which I quite like, kind of misunderstood itself by analogy to the natural sciences. In fact, it has these other components. I like even his historian, statesman, philosopher, mathematician, those four elements. Next, we have another Cambridge philosopher. This is Joan Robinson, a little bit more polemical. I think she did learn math, as far as I can tell from her work, but similar sensibility. You can see the use of the kind of math physics analogy to shut down conversation. They're much more sophisticated ways of invoking market forces than, it was Hugh, not Stephen, than Hugh Laurie did in that sketch. But the final Cambridge, this is actually an academic who's no longer at Cambridge, but was for most of his career. This is Ha-Joon Chang, who says economics is a political argument. It is not and can never be a science. No objective truths in economics, independent of political and moral judgments. So the dumbfounded look on Stephen's face, I'm going to keep mixing up Stephen and Hugh. No, Hugh's face. Hugh is dumbfounded, right? At the word moral, where does this come from? Does it still exist today? So in the first chapter, I speak to a lot of economists, and I also speak to a lot of students. I'm going to just tell you a few anecdotes for what they're worth. The sort of, the journalist model of how knowledge gets produced is you talk to people and they tell you things, and then you do try to incorporate data and research, but you also sort of tell narratives, and that has a certain epistemic weight in itself. One very senior economist who's unquoted, and you'll understand why when I tell you the quote, compared the use of mathematics in the field today to masturbation in the monastery. Those are his words. So once again, a sort of forbidding mathematical edifice, shutting down ethical and political conversation, and a cloistered, inward-looking profession. Not unlike the Joan Robinson quote, fairly incendiary. Another anecdote that I tell briefly involves an undergraduate at University College London who's sitting in a class, they're discussing Gini coefficients, which are a measure of economic inequality. The student turns to the graduate instructor and says, "What do the data tell us is the correct Gini coefficient?" So once again, you have a kind of mathematical, positivistic view of economics, obscuring any effort at normative conversation, which, I think you have gotten the sense already. My view is that one cannot answer that question independent of some previous philosophical commitments. Final quick anecdote. This was at a fancy university in France where two graduate students spent a PhD together. One of them later went on in academia, the other did not. The one who went on was mathematically brilliant, but according to a few people it's hard to confirm this, right? Because these are anecdotes about what happened in grad school. Who knows what to believe? But the anecdote was that the student had not only never read people like Marx, Adam Smith, Ricardo, but had not even heard of them. So they were sort of a legend within the department for their modeling and prowess, and yet had no historical education. So, are economists aware of their influence? This slide could have been titled Creepy Quotes from Famous American Economists. The first is Paul Samuelson. This is a very famous remark, quite aware of his influence. So he says, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treatises, if I can write its economics textbooks. Samuelson got his wish. His book was one of the best-selling texts for much of the 20th century. Then he was dethroned by Greg Mankiw from Harvard. This is Greg speaking to me in 2021 while I was reporting his story for The New Yorker, quite aware of his influence again. So he says, sells about 300,000 books a year. He says, these are future voters. They're going to have some idea of how to view the world through this lens, referring to his own book. Interesting aside, the book sells for about $130, requires very frequent updates to access new problem sets, etc. So there's never, there is a secondary market, but it's contested because they're always trying to shut it down. One other interesting thing, in the first chapter I talk about a group called CORE, which is Curricular Open Access Resources in Economics. They put out a new textbook. Very broad collaboration. Economists around the world have contributed chapters. When Mankiw and I had our conversation, he really had trouble believing that anyone would have contributed free work. Right? His sort of view was that no one works for free, so they must have paid the core contributors. I kind of had trouble sort of saying, no, these are voluntary. It didn't compute that this would be a model by which a textbook could be produced. And then the textbook is also free, right? So it does not sell for $130. And it has a much more capacious vision of economics, closer to that espoused by Keynes, where you have history, philosophy, diplomacy, the humanities broadly. Okay, we're almost done with academia, but since we're at Berkeley, I'm lingering on the first chapter a little bit. So I'm going to start with this second quote. These are some of the real-world consequences of gaining your worldview from economists. So this is Samuelson on CBS in the 1970s. He's responding to the advent of what used to be called Kelso plans, which later became ESOPs. These are the most common form of employee stock ownership in America. So he's asked by the interviewer, Mike Wallace, like, what do you think of this new idea, these Kelso plans? Is it a good idea? Notice once again, the market forces rhetoric. It seems to violate a law of nature, here a biological one instead of physics, but it would be equivalent to lollipops growing on trees. In case you're not persuaded by that rhetoric, might as well evoke the French Revolution, let them own capital, he says. So this is, interestingly enough, this is someone who was attacked at MIT in the 50s for being too far on the left. He was accused of being a communist. So this is what America considers a communist in the 70s. I'll get to this later in the talk, but fortunately, the lollipops did grow on trees. There are billions and billions of dollars in ESOPs, and they're a very powerful mechanism for reducing wealth inequality. That's later, that's to come. The top slide, I don't want to get too far into this. This seems to be an artifact of both selection and training. So people with these tendencies, namely to behave less cooperatively, to behave more selfishly, they seem to be more attracted to economics. But then it also seems to get worse the more economics you study, right? So there's interesting research on that, but I'm not going to go into it. So the first chapter, I feel like I've I've rushed, but I'm also cognizant that we want to get to a lot of other stuff. I'm going to pause there on academia. Really, the rest of the book asks the question, what would it look like if we take seriously an expanded concept of economics, one that sort of returns to an older conception of it, closer to Keynes's view, where you take history, you take ethics, you take the humanities seriously. So one immediate sort of possibility is to reconsider how prices work. The second chapter in the book, we explore something called true pricing. True pricing, maybe I'm not just going to read from the slides, I'll sort of describe to you what my understanding of it is. It captures a very deep moral intuition, which is that the cheapness of the goods all around us is an illusion. It depends on externalizing costs at various points along various supply chains onto the natural world and onto other humans. Some of them will be in future generations. Currently, if you think about the sort of canonical Econ 101 example, think of an apple in a grocery store. We have a patchwork of different regulations that give us some visibility into some of these externalities. If the apple is organic, that does tell you something. There's a legally enforceable definition of that. You could have some confidence that certain pesticides were not used. If it's local, that's a little fuzzier, but maybe you could have some suppositions about the carbon footprint of the apple. If it's fair trade, once again, you might have some insight into labor conditions, whether workers have the right to unionize, what their wages are like. You can imagine the kind of enormous burden on a consumer trying to navigate a patchwork of partial regulations, none of which actually gives full visibility into products, all of which are vulnerable to copycats, counterfeit labels. So True Price has a kind of audacious but simple scheme, which is let's just take all of the relevant externalities and put them back into the price itself. So let's calculate all of these things, whether that's an environmental or a human cost. Let's take the most relevant externalities for a particular good, and then we will charge the additional price. So for an apple, if we know that there is underpayment in the supply chain, if we know that it's had an enormous carbon footprint, if we know that it's depleting aquifers and the way it was farmed is destroying soil quality, we're going to take sort of reasonable estimates for remediation costs, and we're going to add those all into the price. So for a lot of goods, you can imagine this would result in an enormously high price. There was a report from Rockefeller Foundation, a few years old now, that essentially tripled the cost of the US food system. So in some sense, true pricing is a consciousness-raising tool. It's a kind of provocation to say, we can play at quantification too, and when we do, we just see that we are externalizing all of these enormous costs. The consumer-facing application is quite limited right now. There's one grocery store in Amsterdam where for certain goods you can pay the true price with the surplus, the true price premium, so all of the calculated externalities for a given good, they generate funds that can in principle then be used to remediate whatever harms they've identified. So it costs more for consumers. It's an enormous amount of work, especially if you're trying to do it with any level of kind of epistemic respectability and not just make up numbers. Two other applications of it that I'll mention quickly. Actually, I think the consumer-facing is probably the least promising. Two other applications. One is an internal auditing tool. So the European Dutch chocolate company, Tony's Chocolonely, they use true pricing to audit their own supply chains. And so they publish these reports where year after year, they try to show in a very transparent way. Tony's was started by a journalist who's pretty committed to openness as a principle, and who's also committed to getting human forced labor out of chocolate bar supply chains, which is still a huge problem. So their intervention was to try to show that, in fact, Hershey's and other places don't have to operate the way they do. You can get decent wages, you can get decent ecological protections, and still sell chocolate. In fact, people are willing to pay more when they know with some level of confidence, again, it's vulnerable to counterfeits and copycat labels. But when people know that the cheap goods they're consuming or the not so cheap goods are not cheap for a good reason, there's much more willingness to pay. Final application is, which I think is the most promising, I'm sort of going through these in reverse order. I think the most promising tool is to shape government policy. You could imagine true pricing as a tool for implementing a much more reasonable set of taxes and subsidies. The closest this is to existing, to my knowledge currently, is supply chain due diligence legislation, which is being fiercely lobbied against throughout the EU, but which would actually make companies materially liable if they found human rights violations within their supply chain. So you could imagine lots of applications for true pricing. Dashing on to another chapter and another topic for what a kind of morally reconceived economics would look like. This is the old idea of a living wage. So I have a quote on here from a guy who's a millennial in Washington, D.C. named Aaron Sayedian. He founded a business. It's called Well-Paid Maids. Aaron absolutely has this sort of true price framework in his mind here. I'll just sort of selectively read some of this. But he says, at the end of the day, this is what it costs. And he's referring to what he pays his workers. The fact that he pays his workers decently means that it costs a lot more to hire cleaners from well-paid maids. I like how he kind of punctures the illusion of cheapness here, right? There's societal and generational costs to paying people horribly. That's the basic intuition here. So living wages are one of the categories that true pricing addresses. Interesting quick anecdote about Aaron. He's a former management consultant who founded Well-Paid Maids because he got sick of being what he called a mental mercenary. And he also got sick of the stagnant policy debates in DC around minimum wages. So his idea was to start a business to disprove the idea that if you raise the minimum wage, it would harm small businesses. So he says, not only will I pay well above minimum wages, I'm going to pay well above what the most influential living wage calculator in America, which is run by an economist at MIT, he pays well above that calculator. And I'll come to that in a second. So some quick history, living wages are not a new concept. In fact, I think arguably we've gone quite a distance backward in the last 100 years. Roosevelt had a much more capacious definition of a living wage. So some of the key elements in his definition, savings for old age, sickness, childcare, recreation, and education. He probably was not anticipating the cost of education doing what it has done. But it's a much more generous definition. I'm not going to read the Gompers. He's another one. The term is coined by a Catholic priest, John Ryan, in the early 20th century. The idea of a living wage is part of an interesting book in which he argues that our definition of success should exclude businesses that succeed basically by cheating their employees out of a reasonable standard of living. So you might think, if you hear the term living wage, of course, this should be the definition. On the contrary, the MIT Living Wage Calculator does not include some of these core Roosevelt elements. So savings for old age, for sickness, for vacation, childcare, eating out, all things that I think could reasonably be construed as just normal part of life. I think when people hear the term living, they typically assume something often maybe from their own circumstance, and then they just project it outwards thinking, yeah, whoever makes the living wage can do all these things. So the economist at MIT has expanded her categories, but there's also something a little odd maybe about the highly undemocratic nature of one economist setting living wage rates that are then consulted by corporations, some of which in turn fund the living wage calculator at MIT. So, for journalists, this raises a lot of red flags and sets the alarm bells off. But I think even from a kind of historical or philosophical perspective, one could still be alarmed just by the regression since the time of Roosevelt. Okay, so let's imagine that we did pay living wages and that we had a really robust, capacious definition of living wages. Now, there's good research by good economists, one of them from Berkeley, in fact, showing that the anticipated effects of raising the minimum wage on unemployment have been hugely overstated, thinking of Card and Kruger here. That being said, if we took seriously the idea that raising living wages to, say, $50, $60 an hour in coastal cities, 30 to 40 for a lot of the rest of the country, this could still have very real effects on unemployment. So what do? Enter a new slide, job guarantee. I guess I didn't deliver that quite right, but the job guarantee chapter in the book explores an experiment that is currently underway in Austria, where anyone who's been unemployed for a certain period of time is eligible to co-design some sort of meaningful work with social workers. This is a small town outside of Vienna. A few interesting features of the design of this trial job guarantee. One is that it costs the Austrian state no more than what they would already be spending on unemployment benefits, which from an American standpoint are relatively generous. So they've immediately kind of preempted the objection that we can't afford this. I think it's helpful though to zoom out a little bit, and the site of the job guarantee that I write about in the book is a very famous one. It's actually the town where a classic sociological study from the 1930s examined the psychological effects of unemployment. So I have a quote up here. This is from a woman who was talking to sociologists from Vienna in the 1930s. She's really speaking, I think, to the fact that a job is more than money, right? She says, if I could get back to the factory, it would be the happiest day of my life. It's not only for the money. Stuck here alone between one's own four walls, one isn't really alive. So the second quote on here, this is from a guy that I was talking to in 2022. He's describing what it's like to be unemployed. So I'll let you read it, but there's a kind of uncanny similarity here. You have your breakfast and then you ask yourself, what am I going to do all day, right? That same sense of kind of being stuck, not knowing what to do. So one of the sort of basic insights from the job guarantee, and this is not just in Austria, but it's that work is more than a source of income. It's a source of time structure, self-esteem. It's important to distinguish the Austria program from workfare, where someone is compelled to take whatever job comes along. When I say they're co-designing meaningful work with social workers, that is really what happens. They actually sit down with a social worker and they talk about two things. What would they like to do? And then what are things that the community needs? It's pretty unsurprising, I think, that people have seen in job guarantees sort of multiple benefits. You can imagine all of the green transition, care work, all of the many areas in which private markets are not succeeding terribly well. You can imagine a job guarantee not only addressing genuine needs in communities, but also sort of fulfilling some of these more psychological and social functions for the people participating. And you know, the people I talked to were hugely various in background. There were PhDs, so for grad students in the audience, don't despair. Maybe a job guarantee will come along. There were people who'd never finished high school. There were recent immigrants. I mean, it was just an incredibly various set of people. And this is in a small village in kind of, I don't want to say suburban because it's a bit too far outside of Vienna, but it's just a small little town in Austria surrounded by cornfields. Okay, I mean, I'm going to have to speed up, I think. This is one other line of argument that one could mount in defense of job guarantees, is that it provides people with an outside option. So one way to kind of grasp this point is through an American analogy. This is about differential rates of sexual harassment in states that do and do not have the tipped sub-minimum wage. So unsurprisingly, it turns out that if you do not have a guaranteed wage and have to rely on tips, you're less likely to report these things, and you're more likely to report sexual harassment because you feel like the money will only be there to pay the rent or whatever if I don't say something. Now, the same point, of course, applies to abusive employers, right? It's not only customers, but imagine you have a job, let's say you even make a living wage. The job guarantee, nonetheless, is a vital outside option. It's another case, to get all the way back to Hugh and Stephen, it's another case where economics really depends on ethics, right? The same feature could be good or bad depending on your moral framework. Like, is it a good thing if there's upward pressure on private market employers, if they have to pay more because everyone has this outside option of decent, interesting work, let's say job guarantee paid a real living wage, $25, $30 an hour, you know you're gonna like what you're doing. Is that a good thing if then, take your private sector villain of your preference, if they have to compete, is that good or bad? I think it's an ethical question more than an economic one. And this sort of bleak statistic just further underscoring the idea that jobs do a lot more than provide an income. They're crucial pieces of mental health. So, if we had both living wages and a job guarantee, would this actually do anything to touch inequality, either wealth or income inequality? You might think, well, of course it would. And that's a reasonable sort of first response. I'm not so sure that that's actually true, though. And the chapter in the book on Spain's Mondragon cooperatives, which are worker-owned, I think is especially interesting for thinking about this question because they have an upper cap on executive pay. The highest paid executives in Mondragon can never earn more than 6 times what the lowest paid worker can. So a lot of times employee ownership is framed only in terms of bringing up people who work at whatever sort of company or business. They'll make more because they'll have equity. So as the company grows, they'll have stock options, and there are all sorts of, heartwarming stories about people retiring as millionaires, fairly cherry-picked, but nonetheless positive stories about ESOPs, right? Mondragon suggests a different approach. They do have profit sharing. They do have participation in upside for workers, and yet this 6-to-1 cap, I think, is a vital feature of the design of Mondragon, and it actually captures a pretty robust cross-cultural moral intuition that people have about fairness. So I start this slide with some research from about a decade ago, which looked at countries around the world, and it asked people 2 questions. The first question is, what do you think the ratio is of executive to worker pay, highest to lowest? And then what do you think it should be? People tend to dramatically underestimate how unequal pay ratios are. So they said, I would guess it's about 30-to-1. There's some interesting variation across cultures, but this was an average answer. 30-to-1. So in America, this is quite wrong. It's closer to 300, depending on how you slice it. Then on the second question, what should they be? So here people are much smaller than the 30-to-1 figure. They average at about 7-to-1. A plausible way to think of Mondragon is it's a place that reflects this widespread moral intuition. Mondragon is 6-to-1. The other, of course, important thing to notice about Mondragon is democratic governance, where there's a one worker, one vote policy. There's some level of worker reallocation. This allows different sectors to buffer downturns. This was a big thing during the pandemic. So one industry is not doing well, they can retrain and reallocate workers. There's even some reallocation of profits within sectors. Maybe my favorite anecdote from Mondragon was a guy who turned down a much higher salary as an engineer in Madrid, and his line, which I don't know if he had rehearsed, but he delivered it perfectly, was, I would prefer to live here with my friends than alone like a king. So he's referring not just to the pay ratio, but to the sort of cultural impacts of reduced inequality. If you spend time in Mondragon, you literally see senior executives of the company, like they're in the same friend groups as people who work on factory floors. The 6-to-1 ratio seems to have a lot of cultural ramifications. Of course, it's a feedback loop where, these sorts of cultural things, like how children are raised. A lot of the schools in the region of Mondragon are cooperative schools. A lot of the other businesses outside of the Mondragon co-ops are now cooperatives. They're influenced as well. There are even these culinary clubs that are run as kind of cooperative clubs where you sort of get a nice restaurant kitchen with your friends. Everyone pays a little bit. So there's an interesting interplay between culture and sort of structures of businesses. I mean, you can do this with any CEO. I just put Jamie Dimon on here. Take the lowest paid worker, multiplied by 6, his salary would be $225,000. Not surprising that Mondragon literally is the stuff of science fiction, right? I mean, to Americans, this seems bizarre. It shows up in the novels of Kim Stanley Robinson, who's obsessed with Mondragon. I mean, there are some economists who have studied this. In the book, I quote Larry Summers, who's fairly dismissive of Mondragon and of cooperatives generally. So I think there is a real question to sort of take the skepticism seriously. There is a question of how easily this could extend to America. Let's think, and this will be the end. I'm going to conclude with thinking a little bit about worker ownership in America. So recall Paul Samuelson pouring scorn via lollipops in the French Revolution on the idea of worker ownership. Let them own capital. So in fact, it seems quite effective when people own capital. Like my first slide, or my first point here is a study that shows, on average, much, much higher retirement savings for ESOP workers. The second one might be one of my favorite statistics from the whole book, where if you think about Amazon employees in 2018 and you give them just the same level of ownership in the business that Sears workers had in the 1950s, every Amazon worker would have had close to $400,000. Since 2018, the stock has doubled, as has the number of workers. I think they both more than doubled. So you're thinking roughly 1 million people, roughly $1 million per worker. Then I was going to kind of do a historical thing, but I don't think I will. This is Thomas Jefferson. There's a tradition of thinking about worker ownership. I won't even say worker ownership because he's really talking about property ownership. There's an interesting tradition among the founders of sort of recognizing that there's a necessary tension maybe between having a democracy and then having a few landed people with vast amounts of wealth. And there's a sort of anxiety about, well, what do we do? How can we have both of these things? If we actually let everyone vote, they'll confiscate our land. So for a long time, the solution was send people west, increase the number of small landholders. Then there's a whole sort of way that this debate gets taken up by the early industrialists like Carnegie and Roosevelt, sorry, not Roosevelt, Rockefeller, where in a similar way, they're sort of anxious, right? And they're slaughtering their workers in places like Colorado, but then they're also worried about the optics of that. And so there's an embrace of employee ownership, often in a very cynical way, as an anti-unionization tactic, like you're an owner, you don't need a union. So a final kind of interesting model for doing worker ownership, which I have a chapter on in the book, is this used to be called an employee ownership trust. So it's kind of an old idea. There's a big department store in England, the John Lewis department stores are an employee-owned trust. They are part of a lot of ownership structures in Northern Europe. In America, in the last few years, it got rebranded as a perpetual purpose trust. The basic idea is that retiring owners, or even younger owners who are not close to retiring, they transfer the legal ownership of their business to a trust. The trust can then stipulate some purpose that is then the legally binding sort of duty or function, and it's overseen by a board of trustees. It's a way of dethroning profit maximization as the basic animating purpose of a business. So Patagonia famously did this in the last few years. I chat with various people who have done this. I also explore the model as it applies to real estate. I'll just tell a quick story to close. One of the people I talk with who transitioned his business to a perpetual purpose trust ran an optics firm in upstate New York and could have made several $100 million selling to either a strategic buyer or private equity. Very successful firm. You know, he'd also watched in Rochester places like Kodak offshore the entire workforce. He'd watched decent blue-collar jobs evaporate. And the company had this very kind of pro-social model where they shared 25% of profits with employees, I think on a quarterly basis. So he's getting close to retirement and he's wondering what to do. And he thinks about that figure of well over $100 million. And you know, as he told it to me, he basically asked himself, like, how much money does one person need? And what would my life be like if I accepted that? And his answer was it would actually be worse because he would spend a lot of his retirement doing money management, right? You have to kind of figure out what to do with it. You pay a lot of people, you spend a lot of time doing money management. More importantly, he knew that this would jeopardize some of the basic values of the company. The trust was a way to ensure well beyond his natural lifespan. And this is, you know, a downside of them in some people's mind is that they tie the hands of future owners quite intentionally, such that you're actually not allowed to, you know, another person capped the highest to lowest ratio at 10 to 1. So not quite Mondragon levels, but they said this was a consulting firm. actually, technology consultants in Connecticut said, we can never have our highest paid worker earn more than 10x of the lowest paid. So, another example very close to home is Firebrand Bakery in Oakland. Firebrand was started by a guy who was formerly homeless. They have a mission to hire the formerly homeless or formerly incarcerated. He needed capital to expand, was very worried about all of the strings that come attached with typical venture capital funding. The only way he found as a solution was to write a purpose trust. So quite intentionally, the business is locked in this trust, and then any investors are sort of subordinated to the defining goals of the business. So if they realize we could get a better return or we could get a return more quickly if we did not hire formerly homeless or incarcerated people, which is difficult and expensive and takes a lot of training and commitment, that's just sort of ruled out by legal diktat. So the sort of ring structure which I had conceived, which I didn't quite set up right, was that the guy who asked how much money does one person need, consciously or not, he's paraphrasing Tolstoy. I opened the book with a story from Tolstoy called How Much Land Does a Man Need? Sort of a beautiful moral fable. I think Tolstoy's underrated as a political economist, and I'm in good company with thinking that Matthew Desmond's new book, Poverty by America, also talks about Tolstoy a lot. So if I had time, I would tell you more about Tolstoy, but I think I'm going to pause there and open it up to questions and response. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Sarang has kindly agreed to kick off the discussion.
All right, so I want to begin with a couple of things. First, I want to begin by thanking Nick for an excellent presentation and an equally excellent book. It's been my pleasure to read it this past week and to both learn and engage with all the ideas and the stories that you present throughout. I also want to say I'm a huge fan of A Bit of Fry and Laurie. I was delighted to see the sketch. It's one of I love old British sketch shows and sitcoms. Boy, it's super weird to see Hugh Laurie with an English accent after watching him on House for 10 years. And so, but I mean, that's of course his native accent. He's so good at being. Recommend Jeeves and Wooster too with Fry and Laurie. Anyways, now on to the substantive discussion. As I was reading this book, I couldn't help but feel that Nick has written this book for an audience of one, namely myself. Steve did a really great job of presenting all the things. Honestly, I couldn't even remember all the things that I've done. So thank you for helping me remember all the things I've been involved with. But I want to highlight a couple of things that I felt like gave me an opportunity to really connect with what you're talking about in the book. And that is that when I was a law student, I worked in a community economic justice clinic for a little while. And one of the things that we did is we helped aspiring co-ops get off the ground legally. This was super, super hard. And it was super hard for two reasons. I'm going to give them really briefly here. So one reason it was hard is that the law really does not want you to do this. Even in the state of California, where there are several laws that in some senses are particularly designed to help worker co-ops get off the ground, especially thanks to, I think, our unique history with worker co-ops in the state, it's just really hard. It's not like the off-the-shelf option, and you really need to go out and find people who are experts in this stuff. If you have the desire to either start a worker co-op or transition your business to a worker co-op. The other thing is, it's also really hard because people don't really know what to do in a worker co-op. It's not a big part of American business culture. And it's not. It requires a sort of reframing and reconceptualization of how one governs oneself in a business. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that soon enough. But I just wanted to sort of say that, from my own experience, I felt like the whole book, but especially that section, was an opportunity for me to kind of reflect on some of my own experiences working with worker co-ops. So. Let me talk a little bit about kind of how I saw your book. I saw Nick's book as a kind of grand tour of how many of the concerns that we discuss every day here at BESI, that's the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, may make practical contact with the medium of everyday economic, political, and social life. So just on that note, allow me to discuss a little bit about how I think we in the ivory tower, literally right now, may make closer contact with, I think, the very valuable on-the-ground practice of economic justice that you describe in this book, Nick. By the way, to spoil the ending of what I'm about to say, I think we honestly should be out there in the field and, like Nick, should be working with practitioners to figure out which institutional design and policy choices create various virtuous cycles for change. In other words, I think this book is a really valuable contribution to helping us see how some of these ideas are actually implemented on the ground through stories and through people. Now, of course, all of us in the social sciences are at our core about the art of governance. I like to think of ourselves as applied moral philosophers, or if you will, practicing applied utopianists. In many ways, I see what we are building here at Bessie, by the way, as a sort of laboratory for social and legal innovation and economic justice at all levels of governance. And I think Steve was absolutely right in pointing out that this was a very, very Bessie book. And I think that's for a reason. I think that in many ways, we are really all about trying to think of what the alternative looks like and how that could be implemented in the world. So I honestly think that we need books like Nick's to orient us towards both the impact of ideas on the world, to remind us that ideas can actually be impactful in the world, and to also remind ourselves of what constructive paths we might employ to make these ideas real. All right, so for the rest of my talk, I just want to really home in on, I think, what is one really prominent theme of the book and kind of elaborate on that a bit. I want to focus on the various ways as to how the political may be explicitly brought back into the economic, which I think is a theme throughout the book and all the different stories told therein. I not only think that this is important to us and a big part of what we call political economy here, but I also think that in studying how politics and economics, the state and markets co-constitute each other, I think what we're really interested in, or one of the things we're really interested in, is we're interested in mapping the feedback between both states and markets over time. So questions like, how do policy choices and availability of certain legal tools today reshape markets? How do these reshape market structures, how do these reshape markets and the distribution from these reshape markets of wealth and inequality and so on structure and condition our own engagement in politics? So as I was reading this book, I felt like I encountered many examples rife with this sort of possible feedback loop between economics and between politics. I think that Nick focuses really keenly on these clever uses of legal conversion, of deploying and redeploying legal tools to achieve more just economic aims. And I think in asking that, we can ask whether worker co-ops, perpetual purpose trusts, or, and you didn't get to this in your presentation, but this is super fascinating to me, even private equity could be used as ways of sort of reshaping markets in favor of economic justice and not just simply to make people a lot of money or make certain people a lot of money. So I was really interested in how creating space for things like corporate democratic governance, for increased political decision-making over budgets in the form of participatory budgeting, for just simply realizing in a sustained way over time that we can indeed collectively choose things like the price we set for the stuff we consume, what we pay for labor, how that labor is deployed, and how all these intentional choices about things in our economy also change our own subjectivity about what we can imagine is possible and how we ought to conduct ourselves in all facets of life, not just in the economy. I was really struck, one of your interviewees said, I think one of the ones who was working on worker co-ops said, you can't have co-ops without cooperative people. Well, I kind of believe the inverse may also hold too. You can't have cooperative people without co-ops. And having worked with this aspiring group of co-op workers, I got the sense that the idea of governing oneself democratically may actually be daunting to a lot of people, especially if no one's done it before and models for it are really scarce. People have lots of disagreement. There's a lot to learn just about how to run a business yourself, and there are bad times as well as good times. And this is all kind of part of what it means to do democratic governance. But I like to think that through sustained practice, through realizing that by simply, by simply actually realizing that the way we are that conceive of governance as being, economic governance as being apolitical today is itself a political choice, we could actually start to see ourselves as making these sorts of political choices about the markets that we participate in and how we govern ourselves all the time. We can start to see ourselves as masters of our own destiny and more domains than just our workplace, for example, or even our cities. I have a name for this. It's called democracy calisthenics. Basically warm-up exercises to help us do democracy. And I think that this kind of stuff may be even more necessary than ever before. I think there was another one of your interviewees, one of the ones who was doing the participatory budgeting stuff, who said that these sorts of practices of democratic governance are a strengthening of associative life. I was really struck by that because we also live in a society in which trust and social solidarity are on decline. So if we can reconceive of democracy as more than an efficient procedural way to govern ourselves, but actually as a trust-making tool in its own right, then maybe there's room for us to actually think about many of the sort of alternative options that you have in your book as ways of building democracy back into our political life as well, in addition to our economic life. All right, so I want to just end by throwing out a few questions to Nick and everyone else in the room. So first, I was wondering, really thinking about this, are there policy ideas or opportunities for legal redeployment or legal conversion, whatever you want to call it, such as the ones that you're describing in your book, that you think would have like a sort of salutary, virtuous feedback effect? In other words, like, could we think more creatively, and I love this expression from one of your interviewees, can we think more creatively about creating the context and the situations, the institutional design for cascading democratization, and how basically these spaces in the economy can help us do that. And in particular, and again, I know you didn't talk about this in the presentation, but it really stuck with me, private equity. Is private equity something that we should continue to have, with the idea that sometimes you can use private equity to say, create more worker governance rights, more cooperative governance rights, and employee stock option plans? Or is repurposing something like private equity just going to lead us, it's just reifying a system that's already created so much economic destruction and harm already? I also, in a similar sense, wonder about behavioral economics. And I know you've written a lot about behavioral economics, and you talk about it very, very well in the book. But I wonder if at this point, and you note that like behavioral economics is sometimes rediscovering things that people like Tolstoy and other sort of philosophers have discovered centuries before. Does it make sense to actually reach to behavioral economics anymore, or do even the economics profession is invoking behavioral economics just giving the economics profession and economics discipline one more way out of the mess that they themselves have created? Or would it be, say, better for us to actually think about what alternate infrastructure, policy infrastructure, academic infrastructure, what have you, we should be making in order to devise and legitimate ideas about economic justice and economic governance without the economists, maybe say with the political scientists, sociologists, and so on in the room? Finally, this has also was on my mind through reading your book. We just started a little industrial policy working group of graduate students who are interested in industrial policy. And one of the key aspects, I think, of industrial policy making is strategic linkage between economic, social, and political aims to both develop sectors of the economy and promote thriving, but also to kind of build durable political coalitions to sustain that development process over time. As you point out really well, like, you might not find all of these alternative options in one place at one time, all at the same time, but just having a few of these, say worker co-ops and participatory budgeting, or perpetual purpose trusts, and a living wage with a job guarantee, does a lot of compounding good. And so I wonder, like, and maybe this is sort of more of a kind of question of creativity and just kind of thinking further ahead, but I wondered what a sequel to your book could look like. And that sequel maybe could be one that's about the sort of interlinked industrial policies we could envision that allow us to achieve a more just economy at a holistic level. So I guess I want to know is like, can we design institutions that not just make available these tools for a more just economy for those who care for it, but use these like compounding, interlocking aspects of these different policy options you talk about to lock in market participants into using these tools. In other words, to really entrench a more just economy. All right, so with that, thanks again, Nick, for a really great book. Thanks, Steve, for a chance to open our discussion. And I would like to thank all of you for coming by and listening. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So Nick, you don't have to respond to all of that, but if you want to say something, this is your opportunity.
Great, yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate all these thoughts. So yeah, I definitely would welcome the chance to touch on a few of your themes. So maybe we could start with private equity. One of the kind of counterintuitive things in the book is the role of private equity in creating worker ownership. I think it's important to distinguish between a kind of cosmetic version of this and a much more substantive one. There are funds of all sorts of different sizes, from the sort of 10 million range to the 50 million to the 500 million to the several billion, that have as a thesis acquiring businesses on the point of transition, converting them into some kind of shared ownership structure, thereby giving workers equity, and then holding them for a period of time and selling them. So you recognize some aspects of private equity there. You're acquiring things and selling them, but unlike the kind of bad old days of hostile takeovers, this can be called like the cooperative takeover. And you can imagine like there's a version of this that seems really attractive, where not only the enormous number of retiring baby boomers, but really anyone thinking of selling a business, if there was sufficient capital to facilitate all of those transactions, convert those businesses into ESOPs, co-ops, employee-owned trusts, so that simultaneously retiring owners got some kind of payday, they could retire, but then workers also gradually became the owners of the company. That's how the transactions are usually structured, is that workers acquire the company over time as they sort of pay back a loan. Now, in the chapter on private equity, I kind of walk through different scales at which this is happening. The largest scale is funded by KKR, which is one of the biggest private equity firms in the world. They've launched a really kind of high-profile initiative called Ownership Works. Pete Stavros, one of the senior people there, is a champion of employee ownership. I think it's worth noting that the amount of ownership that goes to employees through these transactions is quite small, maybe 2 to 5%. These are not precise figures, but it's quite small. So if you think about that compared to an ESOP in which employees often become 100% owners of the business, it's sort of a question of compared to what? If you're thinking, what's the role of private equity? Well, compared to zero, like 2 to 5% is really nice. And after KKR announced this, there were a lot of news stories about people who suddenly had enough money to go on vacation, to pay college tuitions, to pay medical bills. Hard to resist those stories. At the same time, a lot of other people who had done employee ownership work for many years felt like this was a very kind of cosmetic, superficial co-opting of the term. 2% is hugely less than 100%, so if you're comparing it to 100 rather than 0, it looks much less good. The interesting sort of scale question is that KKR is by far the biggest player. A lot of the other funds operating, in the $10 to $200 million range, roughly, they're trying to get bigger, doing 100% ESOP conversions. Every person I spoke to at all of those funds, common refrain was, we could execute this strategy with a fund 10 times this large tomorrow. The challenge is that we lack capital. People will not give us the money to do so. It's not that there's a shortage of retiring business owners or plausible, successful businesses, the workers of which could be economically enfranchised through ownership. It's that they can't get institutional capital from foundations, from high net worth individuals. There's a lot of fear around this. Partly this is because ESG, this is changing a little bit, but it doesn't really have a conceptual category for worker ownership. So people who want to do something good with their money broadly, they're not as aware of this as they might be. So I guess my view on private equity, like I can see the perspective of people who say, look, what KKR is doing is better than nothing. I'm also quite sympathetic to the people who say it's a sort of pale imitation to the real substance of employee ownership, which should mean that the employees own at least a majority, if not 100% of the company. So those are some thoughts on employee equity as it relates to private equity. You started, I think, with a policy question, and it's worth noting on this same theme that the Employee Equity Investment Act, which has been introduced with bipartisan support, it's stalled at the moment, but it would actually provide a funding mechanism through the Small Business Administration. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but small business investing companies, they would have guaranteed loans from the federal government. So it's another way of sort of solving the liquidity problem to facilitate a much higher volume of transactions. The Work Act, which did pass from 2022, that used DOL money to set up these hubs where states across the country can get funding. California has this, Colorado has this, where retiring business owners, it's not actually like they're facilitating loans, but they're educating people, they're connecting them with services, they're doing a kind of demystifying of what an ESOP even is. I certainly think you're right to point out that it's still not at all mainstream. I mean, in 2022, there were something like 4,000 private equity transactions. There were about 400 ESOP conversions. So it's about 1/10. I think it's exciting to think about what the economy would look like if those ratios flipped, right? So I'll just move on quickly to a few of your other points. So there's a chapter on participatory budgeting in Cascais, Portugal. PB, as it's sometimes called, exists around the world. As with employee ownership, I think it's worth distinguishing between a kind of superficial and a substantive version. So take New York City. If New York City, which has a PB, spent the same percentage of its budget through the PB that Cascais does, they would spend over $1 billion. So Cascais, it's roughly 15%. It can float higher. New York spends nothing like that, right? They spend maybe 50 million. So it's very superficial. Turnout is very low. It's not enough to kind of just set one up and say, we have PB now. Democracy is saved. Cascais is famous and for a reason, which is that it's highly committed to this model. It's actually, they have more people who participate in PB elections than who come out to vote in normal elections. So it's kind of like participatory democracy beating representative democracy. People like it more. And as you said, it does strengthen associative life. You have to sit around at a table with people in your neighborhood arguing about whether you should get money for something, right? Is this a good idea and why? You have to persuade people who don't necessarily agree with you. It's wonderful for kind of coalition building. You'll see like teenagers campaigning for skate parks, but to win the skate park, they have to persuade a bunch of other people, like the firefighters have to get on board. Firefighters want the engine. They all have to kind of get out the vote together. So it is a really powerful and intentionally designed system to make people sort of talk to each other. Interestingly, they're not big fans of digital tools, right? Democracy doesn't happen on your couch with a glowing screen. You have to actually go talk to people and persuade them and speak in public. So I think, PB, it exists in thousands and thousands of cities. Most of them are quite superficial. They're sort of like a beauty contest where maybe you'll get like a mural and $10,000 and you'll paint a tree on a building. In Cascais, they're doing major capital projects, right? They're doing infrastructure. They're like renovating schools, building new places in the mountains where kids can go learn about science, et cetera. It's a rare model, but I think a very compelling one. Yeah, should we stop? Yeah,
Okay.
please, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we have time
Yeah.
for a couple of questions.
Yeah.
All right, Jay.
Thanks for the presentation. The issue of private equity, I think that the language here might be useful to think about because, of course, private equity is a term that came after leveraged buyouts.
Yeah.
It sounds like what you're talking about is just so different than the predatory private equity. A friend of mine helped popularize the term predatory equity, working with tenants of rent control departments in New York. And so it seems like you need something like solidarity equity. I don't know, maybe in the book there are more convincing examples. I have no idea, but and then secondly, I wanted to just briefly follow up on what Sarang was saying. I think that I want to emphasize this point that, oh, thanks. To the
extent we're talking about new business strategies, legal structures, et cetera, or retooling old ones, it's so important. I mean, it seems that it's so important how they're embedded within politics and society and culture, because enforcement is so important, and guardrails and because there's so much opportunity for abuse. My understanding is there's a lot of attention now to abuse of ESOP structures, where people are using them to extract money and avoid taxes, and the IRS is now looking into this finally, now that it has more resources. So just wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts about how to, I don't know if the book does this, but it seems like there's a need for systematic thinking about how we build guardrails, enforcement, monitoring, et cetera, into these tools. So I just wanted to raise that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for those thoughts. I mean, I sort of share your sense that private equity is a tarnished term and that is maybe not the most useful one. A lot of the smaller funds that I talk about don't really identify that way. It's really KKR who's who's extremely late to the party, that is now trying to take over the space and sort of say, look, private equity can do employee ownership. But a lot of the smaller funds, one of the ones I write about is just the fund from the evergreen cooperatives in Ohio. So they initially launched cooperative businesses, inspired in part by Mondragon, realized that a faster way than starting a business from scratch was to buy one that's already successful and convert it to an ownership model. I wouldn't think of them as private equity either. So I like your thought of we need a new term to think about it. ESOP compliance is a thing, right? I mean, they're governed by ERISA laws. It's quite expensive to run an ESOP. It can be $50,000, $70,000 for a medium-sized business just to sort of ensure that you're compliant. I also saw some of the sort of material on the DOL getting more interested in them, so they certainly are abused. I guess to me that's not an objection to the model, and I think there are people thinking closely about the kind of optimal level where you have regulation, but it's not so onerous as to dissuade people from converting to ESOPs, and yet it's not so lax that there's a real opportunity for bad actors. So yeah, thank you.
And Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, I believe, predicted the collusion between the owners of the means of production and the government. So in listening to you guys today, and then from a business standpoint, a business strategic use of regulation, and then we go to political action committees, that the idea that government is going to instill the justice or the ethical component that the market mechanism does not have in its objective gravitational pull of the invisible hand seems very idealistic to me. And just as you were speaking there, I was thinking, we're basically, you're talking about the superficial, we're in a capitalist system, an economic system. And what we're talking about today is we're on the edges. Wondered what you think of that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We are talking about things around the edges. And, I think there's a space for both private and public sector interventions. Like a job guarantee is a public sector intervention into private markets. Restructuring your business as a worker-owned cooperative or paying a living wage, this is a kind of private sector intervention. So there are sort of moral motivations, I think, coming from both directions. But your question, I mean, to the extent that you're raising the issue of scale, of how do we move this from smaller groups to enormous ones, I guess I do see the role of policy and government being essential there. I'm not sort of persuaded by the idea that we'll virtuously consume our way toward a fair and sustainable economy, even though it's hard to resist writing about compelling private sector initiatives. A lot of the people behind those initiatives are actually motivated by a legislative impulse. They want to see these things become law. So the guy I talked about from DC, Aaron Sayedian, who runs Well-Paid Maids, he founded his business to influence wage debates on Capitol Hill. he absolutely wants this to be enshrined as law. So it's a sort of preparation for rather than a substitute for regulation and legislation, I think. And I guess that more broadly seems like a reasonable strategy, is to shine a spotlight on examples that are working, expand the Overton window, while still being kind of clear-eyed about what it would take to actually implement this at scale, which is quite an urgent imperative.
Some transitional tools people have talked about, or at least in industry we talked about, and that's stock options, beyond, step beyond ESOP, stock options, residuals in Hollywood, or royalties from everything to product to the International Longshoremen's Union on every container. As transitional tools, do you cover those at all? And yes, I know they all have problems and that, but have you looked at all that as things that begin to get us, other than the cooperative movement, get us in that direction?
I don't cover transitionals, but no, I appreciate the comment and sort of interested in learning more, I guess. I don't cover that. I mean, I do talk a little bit about ways to build wealth more broadly, right? Because even employee stock ownership plans, they only cover people who are working at those companies. There are a lot of people who can't work at those companies for various medical, personal reasons. And so, I think proposals like baby bonds maybe share a sensibility with what you're describing, where people sometimes also call this like a citizen's dividend, where you actually have a capital account upon birth. I mean, Thomas Piketty is famous for this proposal, but there have been efforts to implement them at state levels in America that have not been particularly successful. But I mean, no, I'm interested in the topic broadly, so thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Nick and Sarang, for a fascinating session.
Yeah.